Last week we introduced the thought that we're in a new situation as people who are involved in mosques and synagogues and churches in the United States now represent a minority rather than a majority of the population. That's a different setting for the church, and so we ask the question, how do we discover what the basics are? Because as a minority movement, we've got to concentrate on the basics. And so we took a look at the church in 95 AD and 1739 AD, the beginning of the Methodist movement. And we discovered that one of the basics of the church being a minority was that we exist to and for and with each other, that the church must be a we movement rather than an I movement. We referred to the hymn that is sung in Africa, "Here we are, Lord," the we-ness. We're together in this, as over against singing in the United States, "Here I am, Lord." And so that's where we were last week. And as we look at 95 AD and 1739 AD, it's helpful to discover the dynamic of being in the majority. Being in the majority gives any entity, including the church, a false sense of security and a position of power. The resulting dynamic of being in the majority is that the purpose of the church becomes maintaining security, maintaining the position of power, obliterating the higher cause, which is the enduring foundation of the church, Jesus Christ, sharing the love of God with all, including the marginalized. I guess one way to look at it is, as comfortable as being in the majority feels, it has its perils. And so this week we're taking another look. First of all, the early church in 95 AD, as we discover another basic component of what it means for the church to be vital as a minority. And the church in 95 AD, we can best understand it by looking at the book of Acts, the Acts of the Sent Ones. That's what apostles mean. The Acts of the Apostles is the Acts of the Sent Ones. And that describes the church to whom John of Patmos wrote in the book of Revelation. And that reason we've sort of centered in on 95 AD. And we have the account in the book of Acts, in Acts 15, of the conference at Jerusalem. I've always referred to this in United Methodist terminology, the first annual conference of the church. Acts is an interesting story of the church. The first half of it really deals with the leadership of Peter, and the last half of it, the leadership of Paul. And the conference of Jerusalem is sort of the pivot point in the whole story of the early church. And I'm going to read parts of chapter 15, beginning with the beginning of chapter 15. "But some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. Therefore, the conference in Jerusalem. So being sent on their way by the church, they passed through Phoenicia and Samaria, reporting the conversations with the Gentiles, and they gave great joy to all the brethren. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they declared all that God had done with them. But some believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees rose up and said, "It is necessary to circumcise them and charge them to keep the law of Moses." Period. Now, obviously, there was not agreement at the Council of Jerusalem, Conference of Jerusalem. They disagreed with each other at this conference. My hunch is they really didn't like each other. I just don't think they cared. They really didn't like each other that much. But through the conference, this issue was before them. And then James made a statement, beginning verse 16. And after they finished speaking, James replied, "Brethren, listen to me." Actually, verse 13. "Brethren, listen to me. Simeon has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And with this, the words of the prophets agree, as it is written," and now a quote from Amos, "After this I will return. I will rebuild the dwelling of David, which is fallen. I will rebuild its ruins, and I will set it up, that the rest of men may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord." Well, all of a sudden, the dialogue and the conversation became very concrete and vivid and real. And at the end of the conference, so when they were sent off, Paul and Barnabas, they went to Antioch, and having gathered the congregation together, they delivered the letter from the conference representing the thoughts of James. And when they read it, they rejoiced. That's verse 30 and 31. Now, the Jerusalem conference can be overplayed, but on the other hand, the author of the book of Acts put it right at the middle of his story of the early church, representing a turning point. That yes, there was disagreement. There were going to be Jewish Christians, people who were circumcised. The male in the house were circumcised in a patriarchic world. And there were going to be Gentile Christians. They disagreed with each other, but somehow they put that disagreement aside for the sake of a higher cause, sharing the love of God with all, including the marginalized. They agreed to disagree, enabling both sides to identify with a higher cause. Maddie preached last Sunday about the dialogue between Jesus and Peter. Jesus didn't say to Peter, "Peter, do you agree with me?" That wasn't the question. The question was, "Do you love me?" And if your answer is yes, act, behave, feed my sheep, including the marginalized. Now let's take a look at 1739. The movement called Methodist inside the Church of England, later to become the church in the U.S. and the United States. It was composed of radically different components. All you gotta do is read Wesley's diary, and he dealt with the rich and the poor. He dealt with the high church rituals of the Church of England, and he dealt with those who put religious messages to the popular tunes of the taverns of the day. That was Charles Wesley, John Wesley's brother's genius. He took the tunes that everybody knew and in the taverns of the town and put religious messages with those tunes, and they became a singing fellowship. They read books prescribed and recommended by Wesley, not religious books, classics, not to do anything else but engage each other's thoughts, not to consider who was correct, but to understand each other. Differences were accepted. Indeed, differences were heralded to the extent that the official doctrine of the Church of England, the 39 Articles of Religion, was sort of altered and changed, and it became the 25 Articles of Religion. And when the church was formed in America, those 25 Articles of Religion were not required doctrine to believe, but rather referred to as the historic doctrine of the church, our cradle of thought that will help us decide what to believe. This was all based on Wesley's warning against orthodoxy when he said, quote, "Believe on Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior and hold any opinion that you wish." All of a sudden, doctrine that required agreement became opinion, where disagreement was accepted. Indeed, what that meant in the 18th century was this vital minority movement that in many ways shaped the early thought and ways of the U.S. public in the first 100 years of our existence. This powerful minority was a tossed salad, not a melting pot of agreement, as was the population in the United States. A tossed salad, each ingredient being distinct from each other, rather than a melting pot where everybody became the same. Now, what does the story of the church, 95 AD and 18th century, what does this mean for the minority church in 2021 in the United States? I simply propose for our thinking that as a majority movement for a century, we have experienced the peril of being in the majority. Our security, our source of power, our understanding of our future has become that we must agree with each other. For in agreement, we present a united front, which will preserve our position of power and the influence we have had as a majority. I was visiting some years ago with a member of another Protestant denomination in the United States, who at that time was experiencing radically declining membership and involvement. And I said to this person who was formerly a United Methodist and had joined that denomination out of personal choice, and I said, Dave, what's happening? And he looked at me and he said, Bruce, we're running out of our kind of people. They had so narrowed who they were and how they agreed. And he said they were running out of their kind of people. That's what happens when the church moves to agreement rather than mission. And I thought at that time, could this also happen to the United Methodist Church? That indeed we're running out of our kind of people because we want to build a united front which will preserve our position of power that we've had as a part of a majority movement. As a consequence, we've lost sight of our higher cause and our calling to share God's love as revealed in Jesus with all, including the marginalized. Instead, we've sought to be homogeneous and share God's love with only those who are like us, think like us, and live like us. Indeed, a melting pot of agreement rather than a tossed salad, accepting and celebrating our differences. We must now accept our reality. We're in the minority. This simply requires that we change our attitudes about how influential and powerful we are because of our numbers. We have some work to do, for as the majority, we have allowed disagreements and differences of opinion to get in the way of mission. Indeed, agreement has become more important than mission. See, numbers don't determine vitality. Vitality is determined by discovering the basics of what it means to be the followers of Jesus. One of the basics is we're in this thing together. We sing we songs, not I songs. The second is we accept our differences that we have with each other. And we accept those, celebrate those, but join hands in God's mission to share God's love with everyone, including the marginalized. These were two of the basics in 95 AD, 18th century. I think they're worthy of our consideration today. And so for our discussion, just a background, let's apply this to Grace United Methodist Church. In my history with Grace Church over the period of years, persons have left our fellowship because of differences of opinion and their desire to be with others in the journey of faith with whom they agree, and maybe those of us who are here more comfortable with only those with whom we agree. So the question is, what must be done to capture the vitality of the conference of Jerusalem and the early Methodist movement, which were experienced as a tossed salad rather than a melting pot of agreement in Grace United Methodist Church? What must we do? Enjoy your thoughts and looking forward to Sunday.